Hi everyone, welcome to Emma, a true infidelity story. I'm excited to share a new story with you. I was 29 at the time, living in a cozy little house with my husband Jack and our Labrador retriever Leo. I was a fairly ordinary woman, average height around 5 feet 5 inches, with a slender build that I maintained thanks to my love for yoga. My shoulderling brown hair framed my face, which I'd always thought of as unremarkable but kind. I was the type of person who wore jeans and a simple sweater. Nothing flashy. My life wasn't extravagant, but it was comfortable. Jack and I had been married for 4 years, and while our relationship had its ups and downs, it was stable. Or so I thought. Leo was the heart of our home. He had a shiny golden coat, and the kind of soulful brown eyes that made you feel like he understood everything you said. I'd had him since he was a puppy, and over the years he'd grown into a gentle, loyal companion who followed me everywhere. Every evening after dinner, we'd take a walk around the neighborhood. It was my favorite part of the day, a moment of peace in an otherwise predictable routine. But there was something strange that had started happening recently. At first it was so subtle I brushed it off as a coincidence. Every night without fail, Leo would wake up at exactly 4 a.m. He'd sit by the door staring at it, his ears perked and tail still. He wouldn't bark or whine, just sit there staring. The first time it happened, I thought he might need to go outside. But when I opened the door he didn't move. He just kept staring, not at the street, but at something I couldn't see. It wasn't just his behavior that unsettled me. It was his eyes, normally warm and full of life. They looked almost distant, like he wasn't really there. I remember standing in the doorway, shivering in my pajamas, wondering if I was imagining things. Leo, come on. I whispered, trying to coax him back to his bed, but he didn't budge. I eventually gave up, pulling him gently by his collar and leading him back inside. Jack thought I was overreacting. Dogs are weird. Sometimes, he said with a shrug when I mentioned it the next morning over coffee. Maybe he's hearing some raccoons or something. He laughed it off, his focus already back on his laptop. I tried to convince myself he was right, but the unease lingered. The next few nights were the same. At exactly 4 a.m., Leo would wake up, go to the door and sit there staring. I started to dread the sound of him stirring in the dark, the soft click of his nails on the floor, as he made his way to his spot. I began waking up before he did, lying in bed, my heart racing, waiting for it to happen, and it always did. One night I decided to stay up and see if I could figure out what was going on. I made myself a cup of tea and curled up on the couch with a blanket, Leo snoozing at my feet. The house was silent except for the occasional creak of the floorboards. As the night stretched on, I kept glancing at the clock, my anxiety building as the numbers crept closer to 4 a.m. When the time came, Leo stirred just as he always did, but this time he didn't go to the door. He stood in the middle of the room, his ears twitching like he was listening to something. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my C*******T. What is it, boy? I whispered, my voice barely audible. He turned his head toward me, and for a brief moment I felt a chill run down my spine. His eyes, they weren't his eyes. They looked vacant, like he was staring through me. I don't know why, but I felt compelled to check the door. Maybe it was the eerie stillness in the room, or the way Leo seemed frozen in place. I walked over my bare feet, cold against the hardwood floor, and peered out through the peephole. At first I saw nothing but the empty street bathed in the soft glow of the street lights. But then out of the corner of my eye, I noticed something, a shadow moving along the edge of the yard. It wasn't the kind of shadow cast by a tree swaying in the wind. This shadow moved with purpose, deliberate and slow, like it knew exactly where it was going. My breath caught in my throat as I watched it inch closer to the house. I wanted to scream for Jack, but my voice felt stuck, trapped somewhere deep in my C*******T. Leo let out a low growl, breaking the silence. It was a sound I'd never heard from him before, deep and menacing completely. Unlike his usual gentle demeanor, he stood next to me now, his fur bristling, his eyes fixed on the door. The shadow stopped hovering just outside the pool of light cast by the porch. I couldn't make out a figure, but I could feel it, whatever it was. It was watching us. I backed away from the door, my hands trembling. Mark. I finally managed to whisper, my voice shaking, but he didn't wake up. He was a heavy sleeper, and I didn't dare take my eyes off the door long enough to go wake him myself. Leo stayed by my side, his growl turning into a steady rumble, like he was ready to protect me if it came to that. The shadow lingered for what felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it melted away into the darkness. Leo's growl subsided and he turned to me, his eyes warm and familiar again. It was like nothing had happened. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the couch, clutching a blanket, unable to sleep. Leo stayed by my side, his head resting on my lap, his breathing slow and steady. Whatever had happened that night, I knew it wasn't over. The next day I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I went about my morning routine, but everything felt off, like the world was just a little out of sync. Jack noticed I was distracted. "You didn't sleep again, did you?" he asked, his voice laced with concern, but I just shrugged it off, not wanting to sound crazy. "How do you explain to someone that you think a shadow was watching you last night?" It sounded ridiculous even to me. Leo, on the other hand, seemed back to his normal self. He followed me around the house, like always, wagging his tail and looking up at me with those big, trusting eyes. But every time I thought about the way he'd acted the night before, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. What had he seen that I couldn't? That afternoon I decided to do some research. I sat down at my laptop and started typing vague search terms: dogs staring at door, weird dog behavior at night, shadow outside house. Most of the results were harmless explanations: animals outside, changes in routine, even paranormal stories. I laughed a little, feeling silly. Surely there was a logical explanation. But as I scrolled through forums and articles, a particular story caught my eye. It was a post from someone describing almost the exact same situation: waking up at 4 a.m., their dog acting strange, and seeing a shadow outside their house. The more I read, the more uneasy I felt. They'd written about how it had started small, just like with me, but over time it escalated. Lights flickering, strange noises, a growing sense of being watched. I closed the laptop, my hands trembling. This couldn't be real, could it? That night I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head. Maybe I'd been reading too many spooky stories, and my mind was playing tricks on me. I forced myself to go to bed early, telling Jack I needed the rest, but as the hours ticked by, I found myself lying wide awake, staring at the ceiling. Leo was curled up at the foot of the bed, peaceful as ever. Then, just as the clock struck 4 a.m., I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound coming from downstairs. It wasn't loud enough to wake Jack, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. It sounded like footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving across the hardwood floor. My heart raced as I sat up in bed, straining to hear more. Leo's ears perked up, and he let out a low whine. "Jack," I whispered, shaking his shoulder. "Jack, wake up." He groaned, barely opening his eyes. "What is it?" he mumbled, his voice groggy. "I heard something," I said, my voice trembling. He sighed, annoyed, but sat up reluctantly. "It's probably nothing," he said, but I could see the concern in his eyes. As he listened, the sound had stopped, but the tension in the room was palpable. We both got out of bed, Jack grabbing the baseball, but he kept in the closet just in case Leo followed us. As we crept downstairs, his movements cautious, almost hesitant. The house was dark and silent, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Everything looked normal. Jack checked the doors and windows, making sure they were locked. "See," he said, trying to sound reassuring, "nothing's here." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As we stood in the kitchen, I noticed Leo was staring at the corner of the room, his body rigid, his tail tucked between his legs. "What is it, boy?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't move, just kept staring. I followed his gaze, but there was nothing there, just shadows. Jack sighed, rubbing his face. "He's probably just picking up on your nerves," he said. "Dogs can sense that." He tried to laugh it off, but I could tell he was uneasy too. We went back upstairs, but I barely slept. Every creak of the house made my heart race. Every shadow on the wall felt like it was watching me. The next morning, I decided to call my friend Lisa. She was one of those people who believed in everything: ghosts, energy, you name it. If anyone would take me seriously, it was her. I told her everything from Leo's strange behavior to the shadow I'd seen outside. She listened carefully, her voice calm but serious. You need to protect your space, she said. Sometimes things are drawn to certain people or places. It could be nothing, but it's better to be safe. I didn't know what she meant by protect, but she insisted on coming over that evening with some kind of cleansing ritual. Jack rolled his eyes when I told him. But he didn't argue. If it makes you feel better, he said, with a shrug, go for it. Lisa showed up with a small bag filled with candles, herbs and what she called protection stones. She walked through the house, lighting sage and mumbling something under her breath. It felt silly but also strangely comforting. Leo followed her around his tail, wagging like he knew she was helping. When she was done, she handed me one of the stones, a smooth dark crystal. Keep this with you, she said. It'll help. I didn't fully understand, but I thanked her anyway. As she left, she turned to me and said, just be careful. If anything else happens, call me, okay? That night, for the first time in weeks, I slept through the night. No sounds, no shadows, no strange behavior from Leo. I woke up feeling more rested than I had in ages. Maybe Lisa was right. Maybe it had been something that needed to be cleared out. Or maybe it was all just in my head. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. It felt like the calm before a storm, a moment of quiet before everything changed. And as much as I wanted to believe it was all behind us, I couldn't ignore the nagging voice in the back of my mind, telling me to stay alert. Because whatever it was, it didn't feel like it was done with me yet. The next evening I found myself unusually on edge. Jack was out late for a work dinner, and the house felt too quiet. The faint hum of the fridge and the occasional creak of the floorboards were enough to make my heart race. Leo was lying by the fireplace, but he wasn't his usual relaxed self. He kept lifting his head, looking toward the front door as if expecting someone or something. I tried to distract myself by tidying up, folding laundry and scrolling through my phone. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I glanced out the window, I thought I saw something move in the shadows. My stomach churned with unease. Get a grip, Emily, I muttered to myself, but even saying it out loud didn't help. At around 9 p.m., I heard a soft knock at the door. It wasn't loud or hurried, just a quiet, deliberate tap. My heart skipped a beat. As I froze in place, Leo shot up his ears, perked and let out a low growl. I grabbed my phone and crept toward the door, my hands trembling. Through the peephole I saw nothing, just the empty porch and the faint glow of the streetlight. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. Hello. I called out, my voice shaking. There was no response, just silence. Leo growled again, his body tense as he pressed against my leg. After a few minutes I finally convinced myself it must have been a prank, or my imagination. But even as I walked away, the uneasiness lingered. Later that night I was curled up on the couch, with Leo watching LED TV, trying to ignore the strange tension in the air. The room felt colder than usual, and I found myself pulling the blanket tighter around me. Leo, who usually loved snuggling, sat at the edge of the couch, his eyes fixed on the hallway leading to the front door. Then the lights flickered. It was just a quick blink, but it was enough to send a jolt of fear through me. Great, a power issue. Now, I muttered, trying to sound annoyed rather than scared. I grabbed the remote and turned off the LED TV, deciding it was probably time to head to bed anyway. As I stood up, Leo started barking loud, frantic, almost panicked. Body rigid like he was ready to attack. Jack, I texted him in a panic, my fingers fumbling over the keys. Leo is acting weird again. Can you call me? I hit send and waited, but there was no response. He was probably still at dinner, his phone on silent. I felt completely alone, my fear bubbling over into anger. Enough. I snapped at Leo, my voice trembling. I grabbed his collar and pulled him toward the bedroom, shutting the door behind us. Once inside, I tried to calm down. I sat on the bed, petting Leo's head. Though he was still tense, his ears twitching at every little sound. It's fine. I whispered more to myself than to him. Everything is fine, but the words felt hollow. A weak attempt to convince myself of something I didn't believe. Just as I started to relax, I heard it again, the soft knock at the door. This time it wasn't subtle. It was louder, more insistent, echoing through the quiet house. Leo barked and lured toward the bedroom door, and I felt like my heart might burst out of my C*********T. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed Mark's number. Pick up, pick up. I whispered, my voice cracking, but it went straight to voicemail. I felt tears welling up in my eyes as I sat there, clutching the phone like it was a lifeline. The knocking stopped, but the silence that followed was even worse. It was so heavy, so oppressive, that I felt like I couldn't breathe. Leo whined and scratched at the door, desperate to get out, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. I didn't know what was on the other side, and I didn't want to find out. Jack, please come home. I texted, my vision blurry with tears, and then the lights went out. The entire house plunged into darkness, leaving me sitting there in the pitch black, clutching Leo and my phone. I could feel my heart racing, every beat echoing in my ears. The only light came from my phone screen, and it wasn't enough to make me feel safe. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just sat there waiting, listening for any sound that might tell me what was happening. And then from somewhere downstairs I heard the faintest creak of a floorboard. Someone or something was inside the house. I held my breath, every muscle in my body frozen. As the faint creak echoed through the house, Leo let out a low growl. His body pressed against me, as if he could sense my fear. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it Jack, an intruder, or worse, something? I couldn't even explain. I didn't know what to do. And for a moment all I could hear was the pounding of my heartbeat in my ears. The sound came again, this time closer footsteps, slow, deliberate, like whoever or whatever was moving didn't care about being quiet. My phone trembled in my hand as I struggled to dial 812, my fingers fumbling over the screen. I hit the call button, but before the line could connect, I heard another noise, a soft, almost melodic whistle coming from the direction of the stairs. I froze. It wasn't Jack. He didn't whistle like that. It wasn't friendly or familiar. It was eerie, unsettling, like a tune meant to lure you in. Leo barked loud and sharp, snapping me out of my paralysis. I grabbed the baseball bat Jack kept by the bed and crept toward the door, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Who's there? I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. My voice cracked, and the words echoed in the silence. The whistling stopped. For a moment there was nothing but the sound of my own ragged breathing. Then the footsteps resumed, heading toward the bedroom. Each step sent a wave of terror crashing over me. I backed away from the door, clutching the bat so tightly my knuckles turned white. Leo stood beside me, his growls growing louder, more aggressive. It's okay, Leo, I whispered, though I didn't believe it myself. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. I could feel whoever or whatever it was standing there, separated from me by nothing but a thin piece of wood. The handle turned slowly, and I nearly dropped the bat. Leave us alone, I screamed, my voice filled with a mix of fear and desperation. Leo barked again, lunging toward the door as if he could break it down. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went quiet. The handle stopped moving, and the footsteps retreated, fading away into the distance. I stood there trembling for what felt like hours, waiting for something, anything to happen. But there was nothing, no sound, no movement, just the oppressive silence that filled the house like a heavy fog. I finally dared to open the door, the bat raised in one hand, my phone in the other. Leo darted out, barking and sniffing at the air, but the hallway was empty. I crept down the stairs, my legs shaking with every step. The front door was still locked, the windows untouched. It didn't make sense. How could someone have gotten in, or had I imagined at all? I checked every room, every corner, but there was no sign of anyone yet. The feeling of being watched lingered, wrapping around me like a cold, invisible shroud. I locked myself back in the bedroom, barricading the door with a chair. Leo stayed close, his body tense and alert. I didn't sleep that night, too afraid to close my eyes. When Jack finally came home in the early hours of the morning, I broke down, sobbing into his C*******T. As I tried to explain what had happened, he listened, his face pale. But he didn't say much. He just held me, whispering that everything was going to be okay. But I knew it wasn't over, whatever was in the house or outside. It wasn't gone, and deep down I knew it wasn't going to leave us alone. It had started with Leo, then the shadows, then the knocks. Now it was inside, and I didn't know how to stop it. All I could do was wait and hope that somehow we'd find a way to make it end. The next morning, Jack insisted on calling someone to check the house. He didn't want to admit it outright, but I could see the worry in his eyes. He kept saying it was probably just some wiring issues causing the lights to flicker, or a loose board making the sounds. I didn't argue, but deep down I knew this wasn't something that could be fixed with tools and repairs. A man from the security company came by that afternoon to inspect the doors, windows, and alarm system. He was polite but dismissive, saying everything looked secure. No signs of forced entry, he said, with a reassuring smile. Might just be an animal outside, or maybe the wind. I nodded, pretending to feel comforted, but the knot in my stomach didn't loosen. Jack left for work later that day, promising to come home early. I stayed behind, trying to convince myself I was overreacting. I spent most of the afternoon cleaning, hoping the activity would distract me. Leo followed me from room to room, never straying too far. Every time I glanced at him, he seemed unusually alert, his ears twitching at sounds I couldn't hear. By the time the sun began to set, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was different. The air felt heavier, the shadows darker. Even Leo seemed restless, pacing back and forth near the front door. I tried to ignore it, turning on every light in the house to push away the creeping dread. But as the hours passed, the tension only grew. At exactly 3 a.m. it happened again. Leo shot up from his spot by the bed, growling low in his throat. This time it wasn't just the sound of footsteps, or the eerie silence. It was a voice of faint, whispering voice coming from somewhere downstairs. My blood ran cold as I strained to hear it. The words weren't clear, but the tone was unsettling, like someone was murmuring a secret meant only for themselves. I grabbed the bat again, my hands shaking. As I moved toward the bedroom door, Leo stood at my side, his growls turning into sharp barks. "Stay here," I whispered, though I knew he wouldn't listen. With one hand on the bat, and the other gripping my phone, I stepped into the hallway, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it might drown out the whispers. As I descended the stairs, the voice grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't coming from outside. It was inside the house. My entire body was trembling as I turned the corner into the living room. The lights which I'd left on were flickering violently, casting strange shifting shadows across the walls. In the center of the room stood a figure barely visible in the dim light. It wasn't solid, more like a distortion in the air, but I could feel its presence. The whispering stopped as soon as I stepped into the room. Leo barked furiously, but he didn't move closer. The figure turned slightly, as if it was aware of me now. My legs felt like they might give out, but I held my ground, clutching the bat so tightly. My knuckles ached. "Who are you? What do you want?" I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. The figure didn't respond, didn't move, it just stood there, its shape flickering like static on a broken LED TV. For a moment I thought I saw a face, a twisted, hollow expression that made my stomach churn. Then as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished. The light stopped flickering, and the room was silent. Once more I sank to the floor, my whole body shaking. Leo rushed to my side, his tail tucked between his legs. I wrapped my arms around him, burying my face in his fur. Tears streamed down my face. I didn't know what I had just seen, but I knew it wasn't over. This wasn't something I could fight with a bat, or chase away with locked doors. It was something darker, something I didn't understand. When Jack came home that morning, I told him everything. He listened, his expression shifting from skepticism to concern as he saw how shaken I was. "We'll figure this out," he said, pulling me into a hug. "Whatever it is, we'll handle it together." But as comforting as his words were, I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread. Whatever was haunting our home wasn't just a random occurrence. It felt personal, like it had chosen us for a reason. And deep down I knew this was only the beginning. The day after the figure appeared, Jack insisted on taking action. He wasn't the type to believe in ghosts or anything supernatural, but he couldn't ignore how shaken I was. "Let's get someone in here. A priest or a medium, whatever you need," he said, firmly. I hesitated, not wanting to seem irrational, but deep down I knew we needed help. This wasn't something I could explain away anymore. By the afternoon, Jack had arranged for a friend of his, an older man named Father Henry, to come by. He wasn't just a priest. He'd helped others with strange situations like ours before. When he arrived, he was calm and kind, but there was a seriousness in his eyes that told me he understood the gravity of what we were dealing with. He walked through the house, murmuring prayers under his breath, sprinkling holy water in each room. Leo followed him closely, his tail wagging slightly, as if he sensed the comfort Father Henry brought. I stayed close too, clutching the crystal Lisa had given me, hoping it would offer some sort of protection. When Father Henry reached the living room, he paused, his eyes narrowing as he looked around. "There's something here," he said quietly. My stomach tightened, and I exchanged a nervous glance with Jack. "It's not just the house," Father Henry continued, "it's you." I felt a chill run down my spine. I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded. "Whatever this is, it's drawn to you. It feeds on fear, on vulnerability. It's attached itself to you for a reason." I felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me. Jack put a hand on my shoulder, but even his presence couldn't steady me. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice trembling. Father Henry gave me a reassuring smile. "We fight it." Together that evening he performed a blessing in the living room, the place where I'd seen the figure. He lit candles, their flames flickering softly, and placed them in a circle. He instructed me and Jack to sit inside it. While he continued his prayers, the air felt heavy, like the house was holding its breath. Leo lay just outside the circle, his eyes fixed on the room's shadows. As Father Henry chanted, a sudden gust of wind blew through the room, extinguishing the candles. My heart leapt into my throat as the lights began to flicker the same way they had the night before. The temperature dropped, and I could see my breath in the air. Leo growled, his body tense, as he stared into the corner of the room. Then it appeared again, the figure. This time it wasn't just a flicker. It was more solid, its distorted form looming in the shadows. I could see its face more clearly now, sunken eyes, a hollow mouth, a twisted expression that seemed to radiate malice. Father Henry didn't falter. He stood his ground, his voice growing louder. As he continued the blessing, "Leave this place," he commanded, his voice booming with authority. The figure didn't move, but the air around it seemed to ripple like it was fighting against his words. I clung to Jack, tears streaming down my face as the room filled with a low guttural sound, like a growl coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Sophia, you have to help me," Father Henry said, turning to me. "It's tied to you. You need to tell it to leave." My voice caught in my throat, but I nodded, swallowing my fear. "Leave us alone," I shouted, my voice cracking. "You're not welcome here." The figure seemed to waver, its form flickering like a dying flame. Father Henry continued his prayers, his voice steady and unwavering. The candles relicked themselves, their flames burning brighter than before. The figure let out an ear-piercing scream. And then, just like that, it was gone. The lights stopped flickering, the room grew warm again, and the oppressive heaviness lifted. I collapsed into Jack's arms, sobbing with relief. Father Henry knelt beside me, placing a comforting hand on my shoulder. "It's gone," he said gently, "but you need to stay strong. These things thrive on fear. Don't let it back." In that night, for the first time, in what felt like forever, I slept peacefully. Leo curled up at the foot of the bed, his breathing slow and steady. Jack held me close, his presence grounding me in a way I hadn't realized I needed. I knew we'd been lucky. Whatever had haunted us was gone, at least for now. But as comforting as the silence was, a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. I'd seen what it was capable of, felt its presence so deeply that it left an imprint on my soul. And as much as I wanted to believe it was over, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered that it might one day return. That if this story resonated with you, please like, comment, and subscribe. Your support helps us craft more engaging stories for you.